There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamma Mia podcast.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
Hi everyone, it's Gemma here, and I'm dropping into your feed ahead of this week's True Crime Conversations episode because I actually wanted to introduce you to my wonderful colleague, Emma Gillespie, who will actually be taking over the reins of this incredible podcast for the next few months because I am off to birth a real-life baby. I am going on maternity leave, and Emma, she's a fellow podcast host here at Mamma Mia and a producer. You might have heard of her. She's been on many of our shows, Extraordinary Stories, Mamma Mia Out Loud, The Quickie. She's even filled in here before. She's a very friendly face in the studio. Emma, welcome.
Hello. Oh my goodness, how exciting, Gem. You're having a baby.
I'm having a baby.
First things first, that is the big news.
Yes, but it does mean I need to step away from the mic for a few months to go raise said baby. And I'll be leaving the podcast in your very capable hands. And I think it's worth giving the listeners a little bit of a background as to who you are, because we actually have quite similar backgrounds. We started our journeys in Radioland, in news reading. Tell us a bit about where you started and what you've done.
Yeah, well, we've bonded over our sort of very similar origin story, and you're going off to look after your real baby, and in the meantime, I will take care of your pod baby. Yay. I started off in radio, studied journalism at uni, broadcast, was a newsreader, reporter on the road, waving microphones in politicians' faces, and then ended up here at Mamma Mia 2.5 years ago and have been basically producing / hosting / making / doing whatever anyone here would let me do, which often includes filling in on The Quickie, which is our daily news pod. And I'm sure listeners who tune into The Quickie would be very familiar with you filling in there.
Yes.
I'm the other fill-in on The Quickie.
Another crossroads for us. You won't even notice the difference, listeners. We are very similar in terms of where we've come from and what we do and how we do it. And you also, you know, a lot of the ones that you fill in now that might be more banter-based, like Mamma Mia Out Loud, but you have a long history of doing interviews as well. Drop some names. Who have you interviewed? Come on.
Well, interviews are actually one of my favourite parts of the job. So there used to be a podcast with Mamma Mia called Extraordinary Stories. You can go and listen to that anywhere you get your podcasts. And it was a narrative style, deep dive, sort of a documentary for your ears is how I used to always describe it. And we would tell these either infamous or exciting or fabulous or brilliant stories about remarkable women or moments in history by speaking with the people who were there on the sidelines of all of it. So people like Ida Buttrose, she's probably the biggest
Heard
one.
of her?
That was the most exciting / terrifying interview of my life. Spoke to everyone and anyone who was ever involved in Young Talent Time, Danny Minogue. On the more serious side, spoken to victim survivors of sexual assault. We did a series on Linda Evangelista and kind of the transformation within modeling and the fashion world and the Jeffrey Epstein of the fashion world. We focused in on him and spoke to someone who had firsthand lived experience with him. So a lot of light and shade, but my favorite part of journalism has always been a fascination with a story that I don't quite understand, sitting down with someone who does understand it and picking their brain to hear more about it. And when I filled in on True Crime at the very start of 2022, gosh, what year is it? Where are we? Who are we?
I don't know.
We did a series on the Razor Gang Wars in Darlinghurst in Sydney throughout the 1920s. And I interviewed an incredible man called Larry Ryder who actually wrote the book that eventually inspired the Underbelly Razor series. And that was my first sort of foray into true crime. We touched on some crime-ish, I suppose, stories with Extraordinary Stories. We did a Belle Gibson expose. She was an infamous cancer fraudster. She pretended she had cancer, made a lot of money off pretending that she'd cured her cancer with healthy food. None of that was true. So I'd sort of had scratched the surface of being interested in crime storytelling, and then chatting to Larry for that little capsule series we did of true crime was so interesting, and it just made me really realize and respect how many people out there have worked so hard to understand these stories and sort of bring them to light for people like you and I and our listeners to understand. And as soon as I was approached by the team here at Mamamia about maybe stepping in temporarily and looking after things while you go and do your amazing stuff, it was a no-brainer. Of course, why wouldn't I?
Well, we're all excited. Well, I'm excited to be a listener and listen to you dive into the world of crime a little bit more and talk to all the brilliant authors and journalists and police officers that our producer in the booth over there, Gia, tracks down for us. I am, to our listeners, going to miss making this podcast every week. It feels weird to say that you're going to miss making a show about murder and crime and all of that when you're off to do something like raising a child. But I genuinely love making this podcast. I put my heart and soul into it every week. It feels really bizarre to be stepping away from it for a little while, but you're in the safest of hands. Thank you so much to Emma for taking care of my little pod baby.
Thank you, Gemma.
While I go off and have an actual baby. And I'll see you all in a few months.